Good evening. Welcome. Welcome our patrons and museum members to this panel discussion this evening. My name is Sarah Justice. I'm the executive director here at the Paris Gibson Square Museum of Art. I am seated because my mic is here and it's going to be really the best way for you to hear me. I'll be your moderator for this evening as well. But I want to thank all of our museum members and our new members. We had a new member reception from 5 to 5:30 today. And I hope that those that are new members here at our museum really enjoyed yourself. We just want to thank you so much for your support and being a part of our event this evening. Oh, clap, yes, thank you. And also for our existing members, we have just a delightful group of people that really do care about the arts, and we really appreciate you. It makes our endeavors here at the museum possible for your support. Before I begin with our panelists' introductions and explanations of the flow of the discussion this evening, I would like to announce a few thank yous. First, I want to give a warm thank you to Nicole Maria Evans, who is, wave, yes, that is our curator. Our curator of exhibitions and collections. She's been with the museum for a little bit over 4 years now, and she has just done an amazing job. She put together this exhibition so thoughtfully about permanent collections, about our permanent collection, what the state of our permanent collection is here. And this is an opportunity, even this evening and for this exhibition, to help educate our community on the importance of permanent collections and what are they in museums. How do you look at artwork? How do you look at a label? You know, there's a lot of didactics and questions throughout this exhibition that help guide the viewer to understand a little deeper about museums and what they actually do and the importance of them in our communities and culture as a whole. So thank you, Nicole, for all the time and effort you put into this, to helping educate our community, also with your outreach to these amazing panelists that I'll be introducing you to and coordinating this event this evening. Thank you, Nicole. I want to also thank our museum staff for their support in planning and setting up this event this evening. I want all of you to raise your hands so people know who our amazing staff is. Thank you. And our membership committee who hosted this reception this evening, and Melissa Smith. Where are you, Melissa? Raise your hand. She's our board president. Melissa, thank you this evening for the wonderful Irish punch that you put together for everyone this evening. Our board of directors, many of you are here this evening. Thank you for your support and time always. Our corporate sponsors, D.A. Davison, and anonymous sponsor who also does major printing for our museum, and I'll explain something that all of our members are going to be getting here soon, and Horizon Credit Union and Stifel Investment Firm and more. We're really supported by our community, so thank you for those that know anybody that work at those businesses. Thank you so much. Thank you for the Montana Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts and other grant funders for helping this programming happen this evening. Thank you also to Eric Heidel and Sarah Johnson, our operations manager, for photographing the images in our permanent collection, which I'll share a little bit more from our catalog. And I want to thank you also, Tim Lee, who's behind the scenes here that set up all of this technology for us this evening. Thank you, Tim. Just so you know, this event is live streamed and recorded. That's why we have so much technology happening, is because we're recording it so people can actually view this later on, or if they're out of state. We often have many people actually coming and viewing, especially when we're having a winter storm this lovely spring. Right? Yeah. So today, hot off the press, we have this amazing new catalog that just came out. This catalog is for Object Number, a permanent collection exhibition about museums and the practice of collecting. All of our members will be receiving one of these in the mail for free. This is part of our gift to you for supporting the institution. Each of the panelists wrote a scholarly essay for this catalog addressing topics such as igniting awareness of the state of permanent collections here at the Square, the history of Montana collections, lessons about managing collections, Native American art and art museums, and topics surrounding equity. So these essays to me are just a wealth of knowledge, great educational tool for those that are interested in learning more about museums. Some of them are witty and funny. Jennifer Reifsneider certainly is. I loved it. They're just amazing. And all the works of art that are in this exhibition, which is around 74 works of art, is cataloged in this. If you are not a member of the museum, options are you can become a member of the museum this evening and get one of these for free, or they are for sale for $35. If anybody's interested in being a member of the museum, we have our staff here this evening that's certainly here to help you, talk to you about what you get for becoming a member, the importance of it, and Brent in our gift shop is available to help you with that. I will be introducing now in just 1 second our panelists. I want to let people know that if anybody has to use the ladies' restroom this evening, we're going to need you to go out this way through the gift shop and through the gallery. The women's restroom is just around the corner here, but because of this situation, it's kind of blocked. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. The men's restroom is over near the west side entrance. All right. So without further ado, let's get going. I know that was a long entrance, but let's start here with Jennifer Woodcock Medicine Horse. She is a PhD program director for indigenized contemporary Native American art of the Rocky Mountains and Plains. I have Nicole Maria Evans, who's our curator of exhibitions and collections. We have Brandon Rainchess, senior curator at the Missoula Art Museum. I'm so glad everybody made it here safely, just saying. That was a lot. And then we have Jennifer Reifsneider, artist and ex-registrar. She also has had an exhibition here at the museum during Beyond Intention, if any of you remember her work. And we are missing one person this evening. It's Gordon McConnell. Many of you may know him. He's an artist and a writer. He's also been an exhibiting artist here at the museum, has a long history of working for museums and curation here in Montana. But he is with us in spirit this evening. Oh, Raphael. I love you, Raphael. So we have Raphael Chacon. Sorry, he's zooming in this evening, I think from Missoula, or are you in Moise? In Moise, Montana. So Raphael is the director of the Bruce and Suzanne Cocker director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture and professor of art history and criticism at the University of Montana in Missoula. He was also one of my professors, and so was Brandon for one class when I went to get my Master's of Fine Art there at the University of Montana. So happy to have them here and have their support. Thank you all so much. I'm going to explain right now the flow of the discussion this evening. So each panelist wrote 2 questions. So we had 12 questions come in. I have selected 6 questions to ask the panelists, and I've selected 2 panelists to answer each specific question. Each panelist will have up to 5 minutes to answer these questions. I ask that the audience hold their questions and comments for the end of the discussion, because we will allow for 15 minutes for audience questions and comments then. Panelists, I will hold, well, I already shared that with you. We'll talk about that then. So I think it's time to just go ahead and begin. All right. You guys ready? Okay. First question, and I have this question is for Jennifer Reifsneider and Jennifer Woodcock Medicine Horse. The question is, how does a collection define a museum? I guess we'll start here with Jennifer Woodcock Medicine Horse. How does a collection define a museum?
I'm just collecting my thoughts for a second.
Oh, no problem. Take your time.
So this afternoon, we were all sitting around a round table talking a little bit about our museum's experience. And I've been reflecting. So my area of academic focus is Native American art and Native American collections. And somewhat to the present day, a lot of Native American art materials, culture materials, and human materials have been housed in natural history museums and university collections, but not so often in paragons of art here. And things are beginning to shift. And I was cracking a joke earlier that there should be a neon sign saying Indian art on John Quick to see Smith's piece, and how lovely that there isn't, but that's relatively newer. And it was a big deal when the Met in New York decided to put Native American art in with their other modern American art. Like, wow, how impressive. And I sat there thinking, yeah, kind of a century late, but getting on board. And so to me, what a collection says about a museum is reflecting a great deal about the values of, what is culturally important? What do we want people to know about? Do we just feel that white men, painters of a certain age, are valuable, or are 18-year-old Native women also valuable, or other persons? I am considerably less informed about African American art or Asian American art, but like some 18-year-old African American woman, is her art as important to collect and show as an old white guy? Not meaning to diss old white guys. There's some very fine old white guy artists also. But it just feels like we're moving in the right direction, but we still have a ways to go with this. How am I doing on time?
You're doing good. You have a little more than almost 3 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, one of my big beats is natural history museums and Native American art. And I want to talk to Brandon later about the Abzaliga Women and Warriors exhibit, which is, so it was developed at the Field Museum, is my understanding, with Nina Sanders, who's an Abzaliga curator. And it is a beautifully done exhibit. And there are amazing details, like little clamps, metal clamps that are holding pieces onto the wall are like hand painted to match the artwork, so it blends right. I mean, the level of detail and thought that has gone into this exhibit is amazing. And it is absolutely a best use of the Field's collection of Abzaliga historical materials. And yet it is still in a natural history museum today. And I have like such mixed feelings about that. It'd be easier to not have mixed feelings if it was a really crappy exhibit. But it's not. It's a beautifully done exhibit. But I kind of wish it had been in an art museum, but it was co-managed with was it New Barger? I know you've got that written down. A University of Chicago entity that works on art, but that isn't like blatant when you walk into the museum and see the exhibit. It was at the Museum of the Rockies. And so I don't know. So I feel like that is a question for us here in the 21st century is how do natural history museums use their collections in a best way? Or should they be collaborating with art museums? Or I am unresolved on that topic, but I keep fidgeting it in my head. So
yeah,
I'll pass it over to Jennifer.
Yeah. So Jennifer, thank you, Jennifer, and our other Jennifer. How does a collection define a museum?
Well, I'm glad you brought up how Native art figures into this, and that there's no giant arrow over Jean's piece. I worked at the Missoula Art Museum for 15 years between 97 and 2020. Was away for a little bit, but during that time, the museum created the Contemporary American Indian Art Collection, which is like a big red arrow saying, "Look, this is the Native work, and it's here in this collection, and it's separate. It's a signified piece of the rest of the whole collection." And I remember there was a lot of discussion at the time. I think that it might have been in 2004 or 6 or so that was named, and it took off with a lot of generous gifts from John Quick to C. Smith and there was discussion of why are we separating this? Why is it important to separate? What does this mean for us? But I think at that time, the idea was, well, we will name this for as long as we need to. We'll call it out and draw attention to it until it's not necessary. So it still has that name that and figures prominently. But at that time, creating that collection helped to define the museum's values of forefronting Native voices, giving them equal space and opportunity and representation. So I'm really proud of that work that occurred back then and still continues to kind of shift or just widen the field for everybody to be there. In addition to the collection itself defining the museum, I think the act of collecting, the verb, is also a way of defining what the museum values. When I was at MAM, there's often an effort to pay artists for their work. Not that there's a ton of money flowing through MAM. You can talk to Brandon more about that. But wanting to respect that this is time and effort and passion and talent, something unique and special, and wanting to acknowledge that. So there were a lot of creative ways of going about collecting, of seeking funds from someone like Miriam Sample or other patrons in the state and our individual community. We would work a lot with the artists themselves, and I think that's what's really special about contemporary art museum collections, is that we can visit with these artists in their studios and talk to them about what kind of legacy they want to leave, how do they want to define who they are through our collection and our future exhibition program. So those have been really special opportunities to develop relationships. More?
Any other last comments? We have a couple more minutes. Do any of the other panelists, Nicole or Brandon or Raphael, interested in speaking quickly on this? Okay.
I think I agree with both perspectives, and I think that it's a very complicated task for a museum to find a way to define the museum via its collection. And I think in my personal perspective here in Montana, it is very difficult. And I think that it's very difficult because there are many different institutions supporting the same collections and very similar artists and very similar work. So when it comes to giving each institution its own unique identity that puts it outside of the identity of another institution, it is tough because we do share a lot of the same work and a lot of the same artists. But then what really does make a difference in highlighting the difference in those institutions is the community that the museum is in. So that is a big part of defining the museum as well, and the utilization of its collection and how the collection comes into the museum as well, in my opinion. So our Great Falls community is quite different from a Missoula community or Bozeman community or a Billings community. And I think at the end of the day, really trying to understand your own community is the biggest task that we have in choosing work that would be valuable to our community as a whole. And in so doing, making the museum a valuable place for that community. So it's a hard task because, like I said, we all support the artists. We all love the artists, so we all want to have their work of art in our collection. But what do we have here at this institution that stands out, outside of others is our outsider work and our self-taught artists from this area. So that's my perspective. I don't know if that was for me, but it worked.
I'm really sorry. That's what I get for really putting the timer on, don't I? I'm sorry, everyone, about that. Thank you, Nicole. I think that summed it up really nicely with what everybody had mentioned. So thank you. All right, our second question. This is for Nicole Evans and Brandon. Museum art auctions in Montana reveal a rich and prolific art community that celebrates art in all forms. conceptual art, textile art, ceramics, conceptual and video, printmaking, painting and drawing, contemporary native art, as well as contemporary American Western genre scenes. Do you think that these auctions determine the direction and the future of Montana's museum art collections, and should they?
We do an annual art auction at the Missoula Art Museum, and I've also worked at art auctions at the Hiltner Museum of Art and just about everywhere else I've worked. This is a uniquely Montana phenomenon. I think when you travel and work at other museums, they don't necessarily do art auctions in the same way. There's still benefits, but not necessarily quite in this composition of a juried art auction. The art auctions are always really tricky, and I'm trying to think of a good way to. The question of determining direction is really an interesting one, and I know Paris Gibson Square Museum of Art's auction is coming up, and MAM just had their auction, and always with the collection, you see those artworks come back, and they trickle back in. You know, somebody will buy one and care for it and love it, and then when they're getting ready to downsize or something, we do see them offered back to the museum, and there is kind of a trust that gets established where there's an expectation that, oh, we purchased this from the museum. This is something that you would like. The difference between auctions and exhibitions are you use different criteria for collections, and the way that collections get put together and the strategies and logic that holds collections together are different than the strategies and the logic that you use for auction and different for exhibition as well. Like for auction, it's a fundraiser, so you're primarily trying to raise money for the museum and generate a lot of income and excitement, and think about that support. So sometimes it has a different value. It's primarily a commercial value, but as Jennifer said, the Missoula Art Museum supports artists' careers. And one of the things that we talk about consistently is the size of the checks that we write back to artists. It's the only time of the year that we ask artists to donate in some capacity to the museum. But then I think this year we wrote $55,000 in checks back to the artists. And so it's really this strange economic logic and economic engine that you're creating, both to benefit the museum, like we definitely benefited, but then artists benefited from that as well. And that's very different than those decisions with the juried composition of the auction. We wouldn't have made the same decisions if those pieces were being offered to the collection necessarily. And it's not a quality thing. You know, you're not saying this is good or this is bad. Sometimes it might be a quantity thing, like, wow, that's a lot of material. We're only looking for the very best examples. But I think with the collection criteria, it's very specific, and you're thinking about a number of factors. You're thinking about resources, you're thinking about space use, you're thinking about composition, what's in the collection already. You're thinking about balance and emphases. We've been doing a series of collection exhibitions. We always try to have something from the collection on display, and we try to go a little bit deeper than that rather than just throw a painting up on the wall and say, see, that's the collection. That piece right there represents the 2,500 objects that you can't see that we keep in a vault in the basement. But we do try to do investigations and use the collection for a series of investigations. And recently we did one with the photography collection. But we have 250 pieces of photography in the collection, and we were only able to select 25 for this exhibition. But it was a way for us to put those objects up, think about the objects, and then make some determinations about the future of that growth area. So it's very, very different determinations with auctions and collection.
Thank you, Brandon. Nicole, what are your thoughts?
I agree with Brandon in the sense that there are very different determinations when establishing, um, you know, the purpose behind an auction and the purpose behind a collection. But I do think, like he said, they do influence one another, and oftentimes there are works, and many times there are works that were purchased at auction that do eventually come back to the museum. I think the direction that I want to go with this question is really thinking about how these auctions present many different forms of artwork in our community, and at the end of the day, what does that museum's collection look like, right? So we're looking at auctions across Montana, and then we look at what's in the collection at the end of the day. And we see here in Great Falls, Montana, that we have Western Art Week, where we have lots of artists who are presenting their wonderful works of art. They were preparing all year, maybe 2 years in advance, to bring their work to sale and to bring it into auction. And then we have our museum, who has an auction in May, and the Russell, who has an auction in March and in August. Now, what we have presented here are very different organizations, both promoting cultural history, both promoting the arts in Montana, both promoting the history of Great Falls, but at the end of the day, their collections are very different, but their art sales are not. Okay, so we have that interesting dichotomy and what the same works of art being presented at many different institutions, but valued differently depending on the institution that it's sold at. And it's shared artists, shared culture, shared identities, shared monies, but what happens at the end of the day here when we formulate a collection is more than likely we will not collect the type of artwork that the Russell will collect in their collection. So even though our artist sales are very similar in terms of the representation of the artists, at the end of the day, our collections are vastly different. And they mean something different because of the mission and the vision of the institution and what we represent in the community. So there's all the layers that Brandon brought to the table. And then on top of that, what does your institution stand for at the end? And can that artwork become part of your institution as a permanent piece of the collection? And if you do, what are you saying with that? For example, our collection doesn't really consist of many works of art by contemporary Native American artists. We have some, but we don't have many, in comparison to the Russell. In comparison to the MAM. They have a super strong contemporary Native art collection, as Jennifer was saying, but we do not. And we also don't have many contemporary Native American artists submitting to our auction. I don't know if you do, Brandon, but we have contemporary Native American artists submitting to the Russell. And we have American Western genre scenes submitted to our auction, but they don't become part of our collection. So as you can see, there's a complexity there that is not very well, let's say, articulated, and is complicated. And it's a lot of things that I've been thinking about for a long time, actually.
And is there, how do you feel about how can that shift and change? Does it need to shift and change? How do you outreach? I think those are all, it's perplexing. Right. It's interesting, and sometimes I wonder, is the status of the institution or the history of the institution in what they've collected, like with the MAM. They started that collection of Native American artworks, but does that mean the square? When you're a small community of 1 million people in the state of Montana, should every museum have a similar focus. I
Right.
think that's where,
Well, that's the thing.
Wonder,
At the
yeah.
end of the day, that's why your mission and vision really kind of describes. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Andy.
yeah, just another second on there.
With our collection, about 15% of it is native artists, so about 270 something pieces right now. With the auction, we did something different where we weren't getting those submissions by native artists, and so we started inviting artists. We did a very different auction this year where we only did about 20 live pieces, not about 20, exactly 20, and we invited native artists and sought out native artists to include because we wanted the composition to be higher. And I think out of those 20, we did about 25% were native artists. But we also did emerging artists too, because we thought in the live auction, those pieces tend to go higher. And we ended up including, I think it was 3 really young, fresh out of the gates emerging artists because we really wanted to support their careers. So I think with auction and with collection, even though they have different focuses and different purposes, you have to kind of make the composition that you want, and you have to think about how to develop that composition.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
May I just add a comment? I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes,
The disembodied voice.
we hear
From
you really
Maurice,
well.
It seems to me that auctions are clearly very different from collections. Auctions have a different mission, they have a different purpose, they function differently. But I think, as Brandon beautifully articulated, and Nicole as well, there is an intense overlap between what the auction says about the institution and ultimately what that collection says about the institution. So I think that it's incumbent on all of our museums to, one, be very aware of what their mission is. And our museums have very different mission statements. Therefore, our collections need to reflect what that mission statement is. So in some ways, it's safeguarding not just your collection, but it's also safeguarding your reputation and your image in the community. So if you're an institution that purports to be representative of minority groups, then it's important that your collection reflect that. It's also important that your auction and your fundraising activities also reflect that, because there is, in fact, a tie between those things. Whether you like it or not, the community begins to associate both the auction and the integrity of the work that's presented there, as well as your collection, your permanent collection, with your identity as an institution. So I think that whether it's our boards or our collections committees or our curators, I think it's important for all the institutions to be mindful of not just their strategies, because oftentimes these are collecting strategies or they're fundraising strategies, but also how that impacts the reputation of the institution across the board, how people identify certain artists, certain kinds of artists, certain types of art with your institution. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Raphael. All right, we're moving on for the sake of time here. So this next question is for Jennifer Reifsneider and Raphael Chacon. How does deaccessioning art function at your museum? Or what has been your experience with deaccessioning? How does it work in theory versus practice? Raphael or Jennifer, who would like to go first?
I'll jump in.
Okay,
and Jennifer, please add or complement or contradict, whatever. Deaccessioning is almost as important as accessioning. And unfortunately, most of our museums, and especially those that have longevity, more than a decade of history, we tend to grow our collections either super intensely with a lot of intention and will and a lot of resources and dedication, or we grow them passively by donations and gifts and bequests. I hail from an institution that's 128 years old, and most of the things in our collection have landed there by default. They've landed there because alumni and previous donors have essentially given us their work. And so, and over the years, curators have wrestled with trying to shape those collections. And deaccessioning is a tool for shaping those collections, and it's a valuable and important tool. But it's a tool that needs to be used ethically. because it's not just simply selling or getting rid of works of art. It's a question of making sure that those works of art are treated with the same respect that was given them when they were received. And so that, in some cases, means being respectful to donors' wishes and the community that has an investment in those things. And your institutions have put time, energy, labor into those works for a long time, and therefore deaccessioning is not something you do lightly. It's something you do seriously, and you take it very seriously, and you go through a process. And most institutions have, in fact, a set of criteria by which you would deaccession a work. And those criteria mean, one, can you find a better home for it? Is it better served in another institution? Can you actually do it justice? Do you have enough resources to spend on conservation or on preservation of the work of art, or the promoting or the exhibition of the work of art? I think, for example, my institution in some ways crossed an ethical boundary by taking so much work over so many decades, over a century plus, and not being able to exhibit that work or use it or research it or put it out there into the community or make it accessible. So in some ways, it feels to me like if you can't take care of it, then you probably shouldn't have it. And you might want to consider deaccessioning as a tool for doing that. But you have to do that ethically, and you have to do it correctly, or else the institution will pay for it in the long run. And of course, we have to think about the value of those works of art ultimately. And I'm not talking financial value. I'm talking about their value to the culture and to our civilization. And so it's really important that when we deaccession, that we do it correctly. Jennifer?
Thanks, Raphael. At MAM, I was involved with deaccessioning in two ways. When I started there in the 90s, there was a whole lot of work that had been deaccessioned but still remained in the storage vault. These were pieces that were clearly had nothing to do with the mission, like Raphael suggested. The museum in its early years had some passive donations of people who were very enthusiastic about having a museum. So objects like a bolt of kimono fabric purchased in World War II by a soldier who was overseas, just unrelated to our mission or the work we were setting out to do when the museum was founded. I say we, like I was there for all time, but I'm not there anymore. And I hope Brandon will jump in at some point here. So in the 90s, we had to deal with the deaccessioning that occurred in the 80s because it didn't help us move forward. It was still there. And it costs money to deaccession. It's not like we can just, set it out in the alley or something. There's an ethical dimension to that. So in the 90s, then there was another round of deaccessioning. And again, all this work that was not advancing our mission, not helping the community was identified. It was deaccessioned, but it did not go anywhere. It still took up resources of space and time to keep records and to know that is not the collection, but we have to keep records on it still so we don't get confused in the future. The collecting is an enormous burden, and getting rid of the collection cost funds. We at MAM, the priority for finding a new home was to gift it to another museum that was actually interested in kimono fabric from World War II. So there was a museum in Florida that said, sure, we'll take it. That'll be a great educational item. Said, okay, it's going to cost somebody $30 to ship this. Neither of us had $30 extra for shipping. And so in 2020, I think that kimono fabric was still in the vault.
We recently reaccessioned it, so it's...
So you're like, you might as well just keep it right on. Yeah, can't ship it back.
It's problematic, but every act the museum takes, and I mean the museum with a lowercase m, I think should demonstrate its system of values and its commitment to the community and makers, and with respect for materials. And so at MAM, Museum with a capital M, we really wanted it to stay far, far away from those murky ethical situations where we might be profiting from just dumping work out there. So again, the priority was gifting, returning to sources if that was an option, and just being very transparent in all of our actions. Now, Brandon, if I can rope you in, you mentioned earlier that there's a little more deaccessioning happening. Can I ask if you would speak to that a little bit and what it looks like now?
We're just putting it in a big
You,
pile.
you know, it seems to me that the landscape right now nationally is riddled with institutions that are contemplating deaccessioning objects, selling objects. I don't know if you heard, Valparaiso University in Indiana has just recently put up 3 of its major works of art for sale to pay for a dormitory, and all hell's breaking loose in Indiana because of this. And it's because essentially people recognize that these are not just financial resources. These are cultural resources that matter to the community. And so it's like ripping the heart out of these institutions to sell them in order to pay for dormitories or staff salaries or things like that. It's a tough call, but I think there are professional standards that need to be followed here. And selling art for ulterior motives is not a good thing for institutions like ours.
Like Raphael and Jennifer said, that there's a very strict standard, ethical standard that's placed on museums deaccessioning, and it's become a little bit of a taboo word, but it shouldn't be. It's really a flexible tool. MAM has been deaccessioning recently, and we go through and examine objects mostly on a tiered system based on active collections, thinking about, Jennifer's so proud of this because she really taught us how to think about this, and asking, is this a useful object? Does this advance our mission? Are we showing this? We have a very small number of objects. 2,500 by comparison is not very many. And you have to think, wow, only 1% of these gets used every year or something like that. So the way that you do it, the sale is usually the last option. We always contact the artist and say, we're deaccessioning an object that has been made by you. What would you like to be done? Should we offer it to another institution? Should we give it back to you? Is this something that you would find useful? Is there anything that you can do to further your career with this object? We also exchange it with other institutions. If there's a piece in the Paris Gibson Square collection that's maybe not appropriate for their collection, we could take one of those objects that are no longer useful to us. Say it's a wonderful Great Falls artist that we don't show for some reason in Missoula. I could contact Nicole and say, we have this object. Is there a trade that would be possible? Trades get really tricky and they don't often work out, even though that idea of exchange is there. The last thing that you do is sell it, so that's always kind of like really low on the totem pole. And then once those, once the rules around sale are very strict, because we follow with the American Association of Museums and the American Alliance of Museum Directors. I got those two mixed up, but that's how they go.
Thank you.
And ideally, if in fact you have to resort to selling a work of art, then those resources really need to return to your collection. I think that's the ethical standard, that those resources have to return to the works of art, to your collection itself.
Collection care in some way.
Okay, thank you so much, Raphael, Brandon, Jennifer, all of you. Moving right along for the sake of time. This is another great question, so I'm sure we could talk hours on many of these. This is for Brandon and Jennifer Woodcock, Medicine Horse. It's a long question. So, Native art has traditionally and often still is displayed in natural history museums rather than art or history museums. It was a media storm when the Met in New York displayed Native art mixed within other American art. On the other side, the recent exhibit, Absoluka, Women and Warriors, was created by the Field Museum of Natural History in collaboration with the University of Chicago's Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society in 2020. It's an excellent exhibition curated by Nita Sanders, who is a Absoluka tribe, I guess, right? The Crow, Abzalica. I'm sorry, I knew I would. Thank you, Abzalica. The Neubauer Collegium developed art exhibits, and this was certainly the best use of the field's collection. Where is the fine line between continuing to promote the idea of Native American history and art belongs segregated in natural history museums, and natural history museums being forward-thinking and presenting their Native collections in a progressive way? So Brandon and Jennifer Woodcock.
Okay, so since I wrote my essay for this, I've been really chewing on these specific examples, so kind of returning to what I was speaking about before, but I feel like there's a challenge in moving our museums from the 19th century into the 21st century. And natural history museums could just completely forget or deaccession all their native materials, which seems like a really poor choice to me. We don't have 30 or 40,000 years of non-native history on this continent to draw on for doing, like a French museum could do an exhibit in a natural history museum about 30,000-year-old culture. I went to the Moseberg Museum in Aarhus, Denmark, which was really interesting because they had this exhibit on Bogman, and it was very old culture like that mixed in with natural history and contemporary history. But that's a culture looking at its own ancestors practicing horrific human sacrifice. I could say that because it's my own culture. I was visiting my own culture there, and their display of horrific sacrifice. But can't really do that kind of exhibit in a heterogeneous culture like ours without creating a lot of potential for misinterpretation and havoc and unfortunate kind of rollout or misperceptions or accidentally perpetuating different kinds of misinformation, I guess. Like easy in Denmark to look at that, impossible here, really. So like the role of natural history museums and what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it, I think is really shifting. I did some research for my dissertation at the American Museum of Natural History in 2015 or 16, and there's the Pacific Northwest Gallery there, which when I went was untouched from when Francois put it together in 1908 or something like that. And when I asked about that, they were like, this will never be changed. It is perfect as it is. In the intervening time, they actually talked to tribes from the Pacific Northwest and completely redid it. So it was a real shift, and from my perspective, a positive one. But that relationship of, is it just indigenous people in natural history museums, or should we bring everybody into natural history museums, and how do we do that? Seems to me like a really key question. Related to a little bit differently than who do we represent in art museums and how do we go about that? So did I get way off topic or did I kind of address it?
I think you're okay. Yeah. So again, I guess, yeah, you nailed it. Brandon said you nailed it. You have a little bit of time left if you'd like to keep talking on it. If not, we can move on to
I am dying, well, not dying, but I'm eager. I'm eager for life to present me with an opportunity to crisscross paths with Nina Sanders, who's the Abzalica curator who created the Abzalica Women and Warriors. And I would be really curious to see what her thoughts are on this topic and how she feels about that it was the Field Museum in Chicago that put this exhibit together rather than, say, the Montana Historical Society in their museum, which strikes me as a fantastically appropriate place to have sponsored that exhibit, but that's not where it landed. But then it would get into things like loaning objects from permanent collections and doing collaborations between institutions in a way to address mission statements and, the purpose. So it starts getting into some murky territory and the arena of, but this is our stuff, because how much red? Okay, all right. That's another question for another day. I'll pass it over to Brenda.
I think it's a really complicated question, and there's no right answer. There's answers that might be more right than others, so it's hard. It's always a double-edged sword, and I think one of the things that is the righter answer is to always involve Native people and the different tribes, and so whether it's in a natural history museum or an art museum or whatever type of museum it is, to go back to the representation, and whether the curator is native, indigenous or non-indigenous, to ask about how the people being portrayed, any culture honestly wants to be portrayed, and you have to have that direct involvement and to be able to show culture as a dynamic living thing, unless it's not a culture that's existing now. When I said it's a double-edged sword, I'm going to tell a brief story. Recently, Sean Chandler, we organized an exhibition that's traveled around the state of his work, and he had the good fortune of being awarded an Eiteljorg Fellowship, which is a really high honor for an artist. It focuses on 5 artists, Native artists, nationally, and brings them in. They spend a tremendous amount of money supporting these artists. And I was texting Sean about something else, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm in Indiana for the Eiteljorg stuff, and I'm up in Chicago, and I'm visiting Chris Papan and Deborah Yapa Papan, and I'm here at the Field Museum." And they just pulled out. Deborah brought me behind the scenes, and I was able to see objects from the white clay culture, the Aani culture, for the first time. These were his tribal objects, his cultural objects were there. And I said, "Wow, amazing! That's so great!" And then I did a double take, and I said, "Oh, wow, that must have been terrible and awful." And he wrote back, "LOL, both actually." He said, "It's so amazing to see these and to have these and to know they're here, but they're not at Fort Belknap, and they're not being cared for by the Ani Nakota College or the Cultural Committee, and it's so great. They're not my objects," is what he said. "They're not mine. I've never owned these objects, but they are mine." So he was talking about that double-edged sword of seeing these objects that are, much like some of the Apsalica objects that are being held by the Field Museum or the Museum of Natural History, and how difficult and heart-wrenching that is. And I do feel like, there's an opportunity there for the Field Museum. This is a dynamic, living artist, contemporary artist who's making great work and being awarded national recognition to look at those objects and interpret those objects and bounce ideas off those things and have a dialogue, not with just the objects, but with the community, with the museum, with the audiences. Here's an opportunity where it doesn't have to be this fixed idea of a culture in time presented as non-living, non-dynamic, or anything like that.
Is anyone else? You want Jennifer?
30 seconds.
Absolutely. You've
Okay.
got it.
I was just thinking about an exhibit that some of you may have had the opportunity to see at the National Museum of the American Indian in DC called Nation to Nation. and it is a beautifully done exhibit about treaties, showing a Native perspective on treaties, a Western perspective on treaties, the actual treaties themselves, but then they've drawn on their permanent collections too, and it comes right up to the present, the effects of treaties, up to today. And they've woven historical objects throughout the exhibit in a really nice way. So that's a museum that's like both art and history, woven together. But it's a nice example of how to pull things together that way.
I think that's a nice sum up, and for us to look into also.
I just want to add a comment
Yes.
here that in some ways, the Enlightenment was a great thing for all of us, but the Enlightenment also has its downside. And this this problem that we see persistently with many, many cultures is that Western colonial powers removed things from their context. They removed them from the peoples who made them and their ancestors and their all these lineages around the world, and they scrambled them, and then they separated them into these artificial categories like art museums or natural history museums. Those are simple modern inventions. The idea of a natural history museum, and I think we have actually today a glorious opportunity to, in some ways, heal the greater crimes of the Enlightenment, to reconnect connections that were broken 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And the way to do that is to radically put these objects back into those communities, to bring those communities back into contact with their legacies. And I think it's an amazing opportunity, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to work hard to repair this breach that I think we've all inherited over the last couple centuries.
Thank you, Raphael. For the sake of time, guys, looks like we have one question that we can ask, and then I have a question for the audience too. So we're going to move right along. So Jennifer Reifsneider, and this is a question for you, Jennifer, and Raphael Chacon. What can artists or artist families do to preserve legacy and enhance reputation?
I'll start out, Raphael. I just asked someone in the audience this evening, what are you thinking about doing with your work? You're so prolific. And I've been talking with another artist, formerly in Montana, about this. I think it's important to, if this is something the artist values or the family, to think about it early and often. And also, I think I'll speak just personally as an artist. I make art as well, and in my personal outlook on life, I understand that nothing I make, nothing in this room, including the art and ourselves, nothing is going to last. And so for me, it's been a process of just, letting go. I still have this little closet stuffed full of everything I've made, and I think I need to keep it for some purpose, but I'm also reading more about gift giving and letting go of things as well. I'm rambling a little bit here. I would just encourage artists to think about what they want to leave behind, what trace, but also understand that nobody can record everything that they've made, or no one has that capacity, and to please not be disappointed with your local museums or curators if they have to say no. It's a hard decision, and it's never easy. I think that's why we have collection committees, so we can say, the collection committee said no. But it's always a very long and involved and heartfelt discussion, at least in my experience. But I think just there's something freeing in knowing that we have to let go of everything, all of our expectations at some point, just to get to the point. There's more about that in my essay.
Yeah.
You can read the catalog.
Great essay.
With the MAM, and now I'm part of the collections committee at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture with Raphael at the head. And I feel very fortunate to be part of those conversations where we can look at the scope of an artist's work and talk about what we think the strengths are, to visit with the artists and have those discussions. And pick something that fits everyone. The Montana community has been really supportive in these efforts of working with families and artists in sharing the legacy among museums. And I think you alluded, I don't know if you were thinking of these activities specifically, but using the statewide Museums Association as a way to connect the artwork that lives in Missoula to museums across the state where it might do some good work.
Yeah, thank you. Raphael, what are your thoughts on what can artists and artist families do to preserve legacy and enhance reputation?
The artist is the central figure here. So we have to work really hard to make sure that we don't lose sight of that they're holding the torch for human creativity and thought and questioning, and they're what keep us human and keep us steady. So yeah, I think all of our institutions need to work hard to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. That's all I want to say.
Oh, we have some other thoughts, both of you at the same time. Nicole.
I just wanted to say yes to all of that, and just thinking of examples of artists who have found a way to make sure that their family history and legacy is solid and secure in the Montana history. And I think of the DeWeese family, and I also think here in town, I think of the Seltzer family, and I think of how that has happened, and the way that happens is deep community interaction, really involving themselves with the community, with their museums, with their schools, with their artists in the community. And I think creating that lasting impact where they are sharing and giving and teaching and showing the value of their artwork to everybody around them, and investing in it financially, investing in their institutions around them, and really working hard to show that their legacy is of value as artists, as creators and makers, but also as people who represent the history of Montana.
Thank you.
The only thing that I was going to add to the conversation was circulation. The worst thing you can do is have a big closet of art, stuff full of art that nobody ever sees. And so for artist legacy and family legacy, it's really about circulation, and it's relationships to the community. It's relationships with the museum. It's sales. It's giveaway. I do see so many families that inherit their parents' legacy and don't know what to do with it, and they sit on the work. They don't lend it. They don't sell it. They're so worried about, like, this is all that I have left of my parents, or all that I have left of this. And it really ends up driving market value down, driving exhibition history down. It doesn't circulate. Nobody sees it, and it doesn't do anybody any good. So the more you can get it out there into the world through events and exhibitions, invite people to study it, to write poems about it, to just get it out in the world and get it circulating. And I think that's really got a lot of value and creates value and creates that connection to the community.
I'd like to throw in a thought that's kind of adjacent to.
Is it turned off?
Okay.
There we go.
I'd like to throw in a thought that's kind of adjacent to what Raphael was saying. Like, as an instructor of art history classes, I don't know how many times I've come across some really interesting Native American indigenous artwork that was collected mid-century, and there's no artist name attached. It's anonymous. There's a lot of anonymous Native American art in collections that I just wonder if there was possibility, like, I realize museums are drastically short-staffed, but there might be elders and communities who might be able to identify the artists on some of those pieces. And that would be really nice to be able to backtrack and identify the artists for Native American pieces that were collected in anonymity.
This is true. I know Nicole's had to do quite a bit of research and ask our community about a lot of works of art just in our catalog that you will be getting. But there were things that weren't documented that we have. How did it get to us? We have no idea. And that's quite scary for curators and registrars that get work. And like Jennifer said, there's sometimes people just collect, or Raphael was mentioning that, where collecting for what? And now we don't have any documentation or history on it. But I think museums are really working towards that's not happening, hopefully, too much anymore, that going forward, everything's done the way it should be, so you can keep the documentation. Thank you, guys. That's the last question I have for our panel. I want to ask the audience a question and give them just a few minutes if they have any questions for us before we wrap up. My question for the audience is, in the relationship between museums and donors, who is in charge? Sorry, I did that again. Exactly. I lost track of my timer. And this kind of plays off a little bit of the discussion we just had, I think.
Please come to the front.
Or speak really loudly, but.
I would say it's both.
Okay.
I think it's both. Museums have their own mission and vision that should reflect the culture, but they rely on the donor to be able to sustain their mission and vision.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a very symbiotic relationship, and hopefully the museum is finding its niche, because I think that Nicole talked about that we, because I'm part of the we, the Paris.
Yeah, she's on our board. Yes.
Art is different than the Russell. I belong to both. Normally I'm bored. But hopefully they are reflecting that culture, but in a different perspective, a different value, in a different niche, if you will. But I think that the donors are different too, that are supporting the Russell, that are supporting Paris Gibson, because they do have different visions and missions and different art on the walls, and are reaching to the community in a different way and reflecting the history of this community, and a different portion of it than the Westerner and the Russell are doing.
Could someone repeat that into a microphone?
Oh, sorry. I didn't put my teacher voice on.
I think what Courtney was saying is it's very symbiotic, and a lot of it has to do with the vision, missions and visions and values of each institution. But the donors, museums wouldn't exist without donors. And donors wouldn't be able to donate or give to the institutions or permanent collections without a museum existing. So, and the values, missions and values are just different. So you can't really have one without the other, I guess, is what you were really trying to say. Because that's how I sum it.
You have to come up. That's why I was saying that.
That's okay. Oh, it's not on.
It's still.
Actually, I think that Sarah summarized it very well, and thank you for advocating for those in the back row that couldn't hear me. Who would like to take on that question next?
Anybody else?
Oh, come on up.
I think that everyone that is employed or volunteers for the museums is the representative. As a donor, as a person visiting, we really don't know what their job is, and we don't need to know what it is. We have to know that they represent the museum, and they're going to give us the very best that they can.
Thank you. We've got Brandon.
Thinking about
Thank you, Courtney.
thinking about representation, I think it's really a tricky subject too. And then it's there's always a relationship between a museum and audience or audiences, and there's always the audiences that you don't know you have or you're not sure of. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about in Missoula is like demographics, like 88% white, 7% native, 0.5% black. I've got these things in my head. And I thought the community looks like that for a very specific reason. And there's Jennifer and I were talking about the drive to exodus Chinese mine and rail workers, and also thinking about the Missoula being a refuge community and having this influx of historically Hmong community, and now a lot of Syrian and Eritrean and Congolese. So it's really different. And oftentimes we say, I've heard board members say, we don't need to show Black art because our audience isn't Black. And I think, well, it's not Black for a reason. There was a Black community in Missoula in the 20s and 30s, and white supremacists and the KKK did their best to drive that Black community out of town and make it so that nobody would sell property to the Black community. So when you think about community and representation, I think, yeah, we have like you said, as a volunteer, we have a really important job. All of us represent that community and all of us represent that audience. And then we have to make space and try to be expansive in our idea about audience and community, and think about which audiences we're not quite doing a good job of representing, or what would it be to have a really great LGBTQ exhibition that's curated by somebody who's a member of that community. What does that do for a museum? How does that open up something that doesn't? Because museums have been run for people, white people, by white people for such a long time that it's like, well, we've done that well.
Okay, audience. Yes, thank you. That was nice. Yes, of course.
Tim, I've had the pleasure of speaking with some students and artists and learning the museum field from the Bray, who came up and they spoke with Sarah and I and Ellie Weber. And the question was, how do you decide on what exhibitions you're going to have? And that's a really good question, and that ties in with what Brandon is saying and what our collections are and all of these things. Is I honestly have to think about who is in our community, who would like to see what, and then I think about, what do I want to see? Then I think about, what does the museum want to see? And then I have to think about, what should everybody see? What should we see? How can we change the lives of artists by showing things that they don't always get to see? How can I show an exhibit that will change the lives and minds of people in this community? It can't always be what the community wants to see. We can show them what they want to see, but it can't always be that. Because if you only show that, you're never going to change the minds, and you're never going to have the mind grow. So it's a reflection on all of those ideas that Brandon was talking about, and then you have to break it. And you have to do whatever is going to do to help people learn and grow. That's my thought.
Yes.
I was just, when Brandon was talking about that bit of Missoula history, I was thinking about an outfit that we have in Bozeman called Extreme History, which is mostly a woman named Crystal Allegria and a woman named Marcia Fulton, who I think they were both at MSU, and they branched off and created this group, Extreme History. And they're sort of a history museum sans bricks and mortar. And they give these pop-up talks and walking tours about topics that would be a challenge to present in a bricks and mortar museum or a university with sensitive donors or supporters. Like there's that voiceless censoring that can go on, not here, I'm sure. But I proposed an exhibit and was told at a different place, and was told in no uncertain terms that exhibit could only happen if it did not offend affluent or rich natural resources donors. And it was like, oh, well, so much for that idea. But they have presented so much interesting history over the years that I did not know about Bozeman, about like our African American culture in Bozeman and stuff. And I think that's an opportunity for museums to like help support. Like they give talks at the Museum of the Rockies on topics that would not get an exhibit at the Museum of the Rockies. So it's a sort of a cool liminal zone.
Raphael, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, and by the way, I need to shove off fairly quickly here, but as a kind of parting word, I was thinking about the absurdity of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture acquiring a collection from Papua New Guinea, both contemporary art and traditional art from Papua New Guinea, or we just recently acquired a very large African collection, an ancient American collection from Middle America. I'm just thinking that, you know, that these collections are so improbable in the state of Montana, given our current demographics. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to see the world, or we don't want the world to have a presence here, and that we aren't connected to the world. And so art objects connect us. They bring us together, and they bring our community, the ideas that make us human together. And so I think, you know, more power to all of us for reaching beyond our immediate traditions and our immediate histories and our immediate concerns. I think we need to think of ourselves as not just belonging to a very parochial small place, but the rest of the world. We belong to a much larger context. And so if our museums and our collections and our exhibitions can take us beyond our daily lives and beyond our immediate boundaries, all the better for us. So, thank you. By the way, it's been a real delight to hear this panel and hear this conversation, to take part in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raphael. Take care. All right, everybody, on that note, I think we're about at closing time unless there's any pressing comments. So we've got some. Yes, I'll get you, David.
My question is to each one of you on the panel. A lot of Native American tribes are starting to put their own museums on their residence. So my question to you guys are, what would be the one thing of your knowledge that you would prepare them for? Any shortcomings that they could avoid? What is the one thing that you would share with them? That's my question to each of you.
I'd say 30 seconds each on that.
Getting a good IMLS grant so they can have a secure collections facility that is HVAC controlled, so that they can curate their collections in a good way and be in a position to reclaim objects from other museums that might be willing to deaccession them back home.
Thank you.
I think I'll piggyback on that and say, if you have the opportunity to have a new building, go with a new building. Try not to repurpose an older building.
We love our building, but there are challenges.
We've been working with Mike Derglo in Salish CSKT, and I think the tribes are really self-determined, and they have a lot of insight in what they need and what they want and how to care for those collections. And I think collections care from an indigenous standpoint looks and feels differently than a museum standpoint. One of the things that we talked about, there's a great article in Hyperallergic that just came out yesterday about how every single museum is founded on colonial frameworks, you know, taxonomies, organizations, and I think that the indigenous perspective on collections care and resources hasn't really been explored or given voice. Of course, we're going to say resources, building, collection furniture, you know, all that stuff. But I think that if we give the tribes an opportunity to decide what that looks like, it's going to be radically different and really exciting.
I would say write things down, but that's how I, piggybacking on what Brandon said, that's how I work. Memory is fallible, and so whatever would capture the memory for the future would be invaluable. Taking time to record stories, share the collective memory and the individual memory too.
Thank you.
Piggyback on Brandon to talk to the folks at the Macaw Museum in Nia Bay, Washington, because they are a remarkable example of sovereignty in their museum and how the collections are curated and conceptualized.
Maybe one more comment, and then we'll have to close. We're almost at 7:30 already. Yeah.
It's actually
David.
all on that same topic.
Okay. Do you want to grab a mic?
Just to follow on that same topic, I was recently in Phoenix, and along with Melissa, the president of the board, and she stumbled upon the Heard Museum, which has actually devoted an entire exhibit to the Indian boarding schools and the artifacts from that episode of American history. So I'd encourage anyone happening by Phoenix in the next couple of months to make sure they visit the Heard in this context. And then I also wanted to say, it took four decades as an adult to experience a discussion around deaccessioning. And I don't think I ever expected to hear one, but having been exposed now to this notion of deaccessioning, and I was looking to try to attribute the Michelangelo quote about sculpting an elephant by starting with a block of wood and chipping away everything that isn't an elephant. That's not necessarily a Michelangelo quote, but people tend to ascribe it to him. And it seems to me that deaccessioning plays that same role for a museum, right? You start with everything that is in your collection and you chip away everything that, or deaccession everything that isn't appropriate to your mission. And what you end up with is a museum with a mission and an identity through deaccessioning. Same way as you end up with a sculpture of an elephant by chipping away everything that isn't the elephant. Anyway, it's an analogy I thought I'd share.
Thank you, David. All right, everybody. I'd really thank you again for being here this evening. I hope you gained something from this. A big round of applause for our amazing panelists this evening. That is the end of our programming for this evening. Thank you.